So we are now recording, and don't need that up there. We'll leave that. So very good. Let's just pause for a moment with me. Lord, so often you see what we deal with here. You see these often reactions of humans to what we're trying to communicate in so many of these things, not only in the languages, but even in the papers that have been written and the documents that are resultant from our studies. And Lord, it's obvious that unless you do a work in humans, so much of what we do, even if it's factual, Lord, it's not going to be received. You must do the work. You are the only one who can. So, Father, we entrust it all to you, and we look forward to what you'll do. However you see fit, use us, and we'll bring praise to you. As always, you alone are worthy. Thank you, Father, for what you're going to do now, as we trust you in the name of your Son to do that work which you alone can do. Amen. All right, very good. Now, just thinking of what we've been dealing with in the last couple of weeks. We talked about last week, I believe it was last week, we did this, the paper that is, we did go into this paper about Eve's reason for adding to words to God's prohibition. And before it would be good if some preachers would read and consider some of these things before they start making summary judgments about Eve and what she did and why she did it and the implications of it and all. But it's as though we have become Pharisees in our modern day, and we just do what we are told we are supposed to do. We believe what we're told to believe, and we never question the validity of those materials. So, but we had talked about this, and I just want to kind of scan over this a little bit before we go into the next section of this paper. This is our paper on Genesis 3:16, 4:7, and Song of Solomon 7:10. The nature of God's judgment on woman. And keep in mind, I'm using that term judgment as just basically, it's a pronouncement, but it is not something that was new. It was not something that was new that God said, okay, this is what you're going to get for what you did. These things the design was already set. It was already established before the foundations of the world. So therefore, and it was in God, and it was perfect because it was in him. So therefore, the woman was the first human to violate God's design for human existence. So the first recorded act of violation was that of Eve. And we're not talking about the serpent. We're not talking about Satan. We're talking about human beings. She had been created to exercise her authority under the authority of her man, the man God had placed over her in his design for human hierarchy. But Eve chose to remove herself from that God-designed subordination. Though some have supposed that her first violation was that of entering into a conversation with another being without having consulted her man in regard to doing so, nothing in the scriptures even hints that this action on her part was in any way improper or even in any way unusual. Indeed, her man was with her, and she was not the one who initiated the conversation. The serpent addressed her first, and she responded. Obviously, both Adams possessed the ability to communicate with other creatures. And, we do that nowadays. It's not quite as clear and distinct, but we still communicate with animals nowadays. And thus the male Adam was also hearing the conversation. Certainly, Eve exercised her own authority to enter into a conversation that from its beginning was oriented to creating doubt in the nature and authority of the Creator. But before the conversation progressed, she did not know definitively where the serpent was leading. Perhaps the serpent's wording, "Does it indeed exist that God said," and that is my descriptive literal translation, should have been sufficient. These words should have been sufficient to alert her that she was being drawn into error and that the conversation was directed towards questioning the person and authority of God. But at the same time, she may have thought that the serpent was truly seeking information. For whatever reason, she sought to give to the serpent a valid explanatory answer. She could have then terminated the interaction or sought instructive counsel from her own head, her man who was with her, but she did not. Instead, having been deceived by the serpent into answering, she continued her interaction seemingly without any concept that she was stepping outside the design of the Creator. She had been trapped by the subtle but totally improper plan of the anti-God angelic being communicating with her through the serpent, and this led her to exercise her own authority and understanding, to add her own criteria to God's prohibition. This was her initial violation, and having entered into the realm of experiential violation, she continued to exercise her own authority in evaluating the quality and desirability of the fruit and in deciding to eat from it. And all of this she did without seeking any counsel from her head, her man who was with her. Eve chose to act and interact and evaluate and decide on a course of action just as though she were an independent authority, unbound by the authority over her, any authority over her. Though she was deceived by the serpent, and I added a little something that's maybe in here. Yes. Though she was deceived by the serpent, she was nonetheless in violation of the design of God. That is, Eve sinned by failing to think and act in accord with the criteria of God's design for her as subordinate to Adam. Nothing in the creation required her to violate. She could have resisted even the serpent's implied questioning of the appropriateness of God's prohibition. And that you can go back to the James passage, James 4, where we're told to resist the devil and he will flee from you. She could have resisted, but she did not. And I'm not saying anything about how guilty she was because she didn't do it or anything. I'm just saying she did not do this. Simple statement of fact. She had accurately heard God's design from her man, but she did not conform herself to what he had expressed. Her violation of God's design was to usurp authority she did not possess. This idea of authority is a very important thing because it is still the primary issue between God and man in this day and age. Eve thus usurped a level of authority which did not belong to her. Despite the fact that the serpent addressed himself directly to Eve, she could have deferred to her husband, her head. The scripture indicates that Adam was indeed present, a condition that would not have escaped the serpent's discernment, and one upon which he certainly intended to capitalize. Apparently, Satan, the serpent, did not think that he would be successful in approaching Adam directly. He was, however, more arum. And by the way, when I put that NG on the front of arum, that's just indicative that the letter at the first letter of this word is an ayin, and it does not mean you pronounce it narum. That's simply silly. So he was, however, more arum, more clever, that's what the word means, more able to design an effective plan of action to accomplish what he desired. That's what the word means, than were the other beasts of creation. As an angelic creature merely using the body of the serpent, Satan knew God's hierarchy for man and woman, and he must have recognized the implications of deceiving the only creature specifically designed to be not only a helper corresponding to Adam, but also the only being under the man's authority which was built directly from a part of the man's body. The bond, the cleaving relationship that God had created between the man and his wife could not have been overlooked by the serpent. And he was clever enough to use that bond to man's detriment. If he, Satan, could but deceive the subordinate to act as though she were the superior, and then to express her desire for her husband to violate that which he knew would be a violation of God's design, the man might succumb to the desire which his woman sought to bring about in his life. Certainly the adversary understood in some measure the powerful influence of the woman in the life of her man, and he may have considered it to be the only influence which could move the man to violate. Why the man might actually violate did not matter in the final analysis. The issue was to use whatever was at hand to bring the man to violate the Creator's design. And Satan recognized the need for the male, the head, to violate God's design. He recognized that corruption of the only race, and we're talking about the human race as opposed to an angelic race or an animal race. We're not talking about races among humans. That's totally wrong thinking. But he recognized that corruption of the only race that bore the image and likeness of God could not be accomplished by deceiving the subordinate alone, the head, the male, the first created human, the one who bore the responsibility primary responsibility, that is, under the Creator, would have to be corrupted. Though the first man might have successfully resisted against any direct attempt of Satan to corrupt him, that same man, driven by the nature of his headship over his wife and his accountability to God for fulfilling that headship, might be moved to submit to her will, even if she indicated her will to involve violating the Creator's will. This was Satan's well-crafted plan, and it worked to perfection, quote unquote. He would deceive the woman into entering a state of having violated God's design by usurping authority, and she would then extend her misappropriated authority by expressing her desire for the man to join her in her state of violation. And the man, though undeceived, was to be moved to willfully usurp an authority reserved only for the Creator. And then we had this little paragraph. Every person does only that which is his or her will to do. And I have a separate paper in the biblical theology regarding the will of things, if you will. Now, let's go into this. So the woman was enticed through deceit. The man's choice was purely his own. The serpent provided Eve with additional information, further insight. See, this happens nowadays with people. Well, it could have been this. What was the thing we were listening to just yesterday? A preacher in a church, and he was saying something about Moses writing. Yes, it was a message somebody was sharing who went to Central. What is this? Central Baptist Theological Seminary. What was that? Say again.
Was that the one that I sent you yesterday? That Sunday school session?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And you hear this kind of thing all the time. And it's Central Seminary in Virginia Beach at Colonial Baptist Church, and I'm not speaking of them particularly, because I'm telling you the things that the man was saying and the way he was doing it. Basically, they're things that are taught and learned in virtually all of our, shall we say, conservative Baptist seminaries, and so forth.
You know him.
What?
And you know him.
Yes, and I know those individuals there too. But that doesn't mean, I know these people. I love them. I'd love to help them. But I also know that most of these people, they are not interested in learning. They're interested in just promoting their erroneous insights, we'll say. But the serpent provided Eve with additional information, further insight regarding God's purpose in forbidding them to eat from that one particular tree. In so doing, he helped her reframe her thoughts about God's prohibition. This is why false teachers are so absolutely dangerous, because they're so close to the truth, it seems like, and yet they are so far from it. And he thereby influenced a change in her will in the matter. This is the essence of deceit. Information is presented to the perception of a receiver in a manner intended to convince the receiver to act on that information in a way contrary to truth and right, but which accomplishes the design of the presenter and not the design of God in this case. In the interaction between Eve and the serpent presented information with the intention that she would be convinced, wrongly so, to violate not only God's design for her to not eat of the fruit, but also to violate her God-designed relationship to her husband. Satan's presentation was successful. The woman was deceived into believing that she should eat, and she did exactly that. On the other hand, Adam apparently did not need any help from Satan to convince him to violate the criteria God had imposed upon his existence. He, Adam, now keep this in mind, you got to keep in mind, Adam is the head over the creation. All Eretz is under him. So what God had brought into existence, as we saw it in verse 1, that's all the Eretz that he brought into existence is under the authority of Adam. He is the representative of God. And there had been no violation. There was no negative result of violation that existed. So before you judge Adam a little bit too harshly, you better consider what his state was as the primary representative of God to the creation. There was no being higher. So, but that apparently made him not need any help from Satan to convince him to violate the criteria God had imposed upon his existence. He, Adam, under God, was the supreme authority over the creation and its inhabitants. He was the very image and likeness of the Creator, the primary representative of the Creator to everything else comprised of God's basic matter. Eve, his subordinate, being deceived, had usurped a measure of that authority and stepped outside the design of God. Perhaps he did not perceive any change after her violation. And if he did not, he may have reasoned that the negative effects of violation would be outweighed by what he would gain. Whatever his reasoning, he, Adam, would not be deceived. He would act upon his own volition, his own will. He would utilize his superior authority, not following Eve's example or her expression of her will for him to transgress God's design as she had, but like her, he would usurp authority God had not delegated to him. Adam would eat, and he would do so convinced by his own desires in the matter. Like Satan before him, Satan always wanted to be like the Most High, never thinking he'd be above the Most High. He just wanted to be like the Most High. And that's what he offered to Adam and Eve. Oh, you'll be like gods. Well, the only God they knew was the God. They didn't know gods out there. So the thing is, so they would be like God, and they'd be able to decide good and evil for themselves. So they'd be able to decide whether to do what God would want them to do, or they could do what they wanted themselves to do. And that's what Satan wanted. But I submit to you, no created being could conceive being above the transcendent Creator. Now, I know some people say, well, how do you prove that? I don't prove it, but I'm going to tell you, I don't have a doubt it's true. So, like Satan before him, Adam would desire to be like the Most High. That is, he would desire to be in a position where he could choose to do God's expressed will, or he could choose to do his own will. But either way, The choice was his. He would decide good and evil for himself, and he did exactly that, but not with the result he expected. And keep in mind, as we get down to this, when we start talking about thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee, these things are going to play right into that. God did not give an arbitrary judgment, as we say. He did not just say, well, okay, I'm going to put this on you. No. Whatever God did was always a perfect representation of his person and his previously existing design. So you notice here, I say God's system changed. Well, the change was not God saying, okay, that didn't work. I'm going to do something different here. The change that occurred in the conditions of man's existence were conditions that existed in the creation system before God ever brought the first physical elements of the creation into existence. They were there, and that's what happened when Adam violated. And we could see that when we get a little farther along in the text. But God's system changed, quote unquote, the conditions of man's existence in accord with his violation. When the first man, Adam, the created head over all the physical realm, willfully violated the design of his creator, he activated a specific set of criteria which were already in place in the creator's perfect system. Keep in mind, you remember when Adam and Eve violated and they hid themselves and they tried to cover themselves, and as though they could get away from God. They were afraid of God, something they had never experienced before. Now, what happened is, and that happened before God ever came and pronounced one word of quote unquote judgment upon them. This all happened in the created beings the moment that Adam violated. And it apparently had happened to shall we say, to a lesser significance degree in the woman when she violated. But so he activated a governing set of conditions which was exactly fitting for his violation. That's what happened. These criteria, though expressed in general terms, were not randomly determined or applied. Neither were they determined by the created beings upon whom they were imposed. This same God who established the original pre-fall, and I don't like the word fall, period, design criteria set the conditions of what is called the fall. No created being, nor all of them, knew all of the conditions that would be needed after the human violated, and none possessed the power to change the conditions of everything in existence. That ability resided in the perfect creator alone. God had never delegated such power to any being. He, the transcendent creator, he alone possessed all that was needed to establish and make operative the new set of conditions necessary to turn his straying humanity back to himself. He was the one who had designed the life of man to be a life of blessedness, a life of glory, a life of incomprehensible value, and it remained to him to set the new criteria that would turn man from his way of destruction into the blessedness for which he had been designed. And God's purpose was unchanged. Listen, God never changed his purpose. And this is why I don't like dispensationality worth a plug nickel nowadays. I can see how God worked at different times in human history, but the design of God never changed. God never changed. And the way he worked was just different manifestations of the same set of criteria that he had always had, because they were criteria of his unchanging, unchangeable person. So just as God himself is unchanging and unchangeable, in the same manner, his purpose is unchanging and unchangeable. His original loving design for his creation never changed. You know, a lot of people make God appear to be one who, when somebody violates, it's like he's going to get back at them. Now he's mad, and boy, he's going to get them. Well, that's not God. That's not the way it works. We must keep in mind, if he wanted to get back at something, he could speak it out of existence, but he has chosen to not do so. Even in its fallen condition, he still desired reconciliation and an unalienated relationship between him and the creation. This was the mindset of God as he set the conditions of man's, quote, fallen, unquote, condition, or existence, I should say. He did not act in anger as man would. He was not vindictive in the human sense of the word. He was not embarrassed, nor was there any sense of compulsion to get even with anyone. He could have spoken the creation out of existence and started with a new one, but he did not do so. His majesty so far exceeded the entirety of creation that the whole of creation could not injure or thwart him in any way. His transcendent majesty could not have been equaled by all the majesty he had invested in all he created. The criteria of the fall were, like the Creator who established them, perfect. They were exactly right, an expression of his love, and they could be no less. As he had done in the beginning, he gave perfect conditions that were designed to bring about his purpose. And listen, his purpose for man to walk with him in a glorious existence, but an existence where man would experience undesirable conditions whenever he violated any criterion of the way to blessedness. This was his original design, and Adam and Eve experienced it. The design was already there. They were designed to walk with him in a glorious existence, but they had also been built. They had been constructed. They had been invested with this nature, wherein if they violated the criteria of his design or any criterion, then they would experience undesirable conditions in their life, and those conditions were designed to turn them back to the way of blessedness. It's the same thing that's happening now. And Rebecca, we've talked about this, and we call it God's two-headed arrow. You go the wrong way, you get bad things trying to turn you back to the right way. You go the right way, you get confirmations that you're on the way to the right. As the serpent had promised, their eyes were opened, but not with the expected result. They did not become like the God who had made them. They did not become able to determine good and evil for themselves, but remained subject to the determinations he had already established. Their overstepping of his boundary did not usher in a new, higher, more enlightened state of existence. Instead, something had changed, but not for the better. Now, violation of God's expression of himself was violation of his person. So violation of his expression is violation of his person. And this is in another paper that we have about the relationship, and I think I have the paper up, but I did not intend to. Yes, the relationship between who God is and what God says. That's another paper, and that paper is only 10 pages long. So now, Adam and Eve recognized that their violation of God's expressed will was a violation of his person, and a sense of alienation came into existence in their hearts. Their nakedness and their awareness of it left them exposed before the one whose design they had rejected. And by the way, I have another paper that deals with nakedness and the significance of nakedness. That's not a part of this now, and I might have to try to find that one, Rebecca, sometime. But they had been left exposed before the one whose design they had rejected. And though they sought to escape, though they sought to avoid being exposed for what they were and what they had done, escape was impossible. They knew that God would manifest his presence with them, and suddenly The very thought of such close interaction with him was no longer desirable. Something within them, somehow within them, a new sense, a new emotion had arisen regarding their contact with God. They had violated the criteria of what would come to be called the fear of God. And the fear of God is not afraidness of God. That's a totally wrong definition. And it's one of those things that is ruining people by probably the millions in this day and age. So they had violated the criteria of what would come to be called the fear of God. Notice, fear and criteria are one and the same in that sense, synonymous relationship. The fear of the Lord. And their violation had awakened in them a new emotion. They would call the new emotion by the same name as that which they had violated. They had violated God's criteria, his fear, and that violation aroused within them the emotion of fear. Now, consider fear. Why would God want us to fear? Why was fear a part of God's original good design? Then this new emotion was not the product of man or of angel. The Creator had so constructed humankind that the violation of his design, his fear, would cause a commensurate sense of fear, that's afraidness, we'll say, in the violator. The condition was inherent in man's design. He had been made this way. And while Adam and Eve were the first to know it experientially, they were by no means the last. Every descendant of that original pair, every human being of all time has known it. Whether they have accurately identified it with the true Creator God or with some real or imagined godlike being, all have experienced the sense of fear that arises from violating the criteria of an authority. In reality, don't think I need that. Okay. In reality, that sense of fear experienced by Adam and Eve was immeasurably beneficial to humankind. The first pair had violated the design of God from a perspective that did not include an afraidness of the result. Adam and Eve did not possess an afraidness of the result. There was no fear, the emotional fear, there was no emotional fear existing prior to the violation. Their decision to eat of the fruit was but an expression of their sovereignty, just as God's instruction for them to not eat was an expression of his sovereignty. They were not possessed of a fallen nature, wherein their every thought and action was from an alienated perspective. They simply reached a conclusion, pursued it, and reaped a harvest they must have perceived to some extent. They had responded to counsel. The only problem was that the counsel was neither motivated from a desire to honor the Creator, nor was it accurate according to the standard of truth the Creator had provided. After the fall, man's sense of fear would serve to restrain him from violating the Creator's way and experiencing the loss of blessing. But God provided an even greater reminder. God provided a perfect set of cause and effect living conditions. So I think this one's been substantially modified today, but we'll go from there. Knowing his human creations perfectly and completely, the Creator had constructed the creation and all its functions and interactions to provide humans with a workable, understandable system in which they could apply their image and likeness to conceive and perceive the results of their activities before those actions were done. This system was perfect. If they applied it as God had designed and revealed, then it would bring success and blessing. But if they applied the criteria of any other supposed system, then God's transcendent, inescapable system would bring failure and destruction. And that failure and destruction was designed to cause humans to turn back to his way of success and blessing. In the present day, humanity in general has recognized these laws of cause and effect. They recognize that whenever something is done or something happens, then certain other conditions, results, we might say, occur. The results are related to the nature of whatever was done. Keep in mind, the results that come from something that happens or something that's done are related to whatever the action was. In other words, when you we like to talk about gravity, and we say, well, when you jump off of a building and you hit the ground and you're injured in some way, you don't suddenly grow wings and fly off. That doesn't happen when you hit the ground. The things that are experienced as a result of the actions are related to that action and the way God has built the creation and its systems. So the results are related to the nature of whatever was done, and those results are inescapable, inexorable. That is, unless some other cause and effect law is applied to influence the nature and extent of the first action. And Heather, are you there?
We're here.
Okay, Heather, you know what we were talking about the sins of the fathers being visited on the children to the third and the fourth generation?
Yes.
Are you listening? Okay. And
Yes,
and remember, you said unless something else happens, didn't you? What were you talking about happening to keep
Yes.
the sins of the fathers from being visited on the children to the third and the fourth generation? What were you talking about if something else happened in between?
Unless somebody reaches them.
What do you mean reaches them? How so? With what?
Tells them the truth about living according to God's design.
So the results are inescapable and inexorable, that the sins of the fathers are going to be visited on the children to the third and the fourth generation, unless one of those children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren hear the truth and turn from error and turn back to God and are reconciled by the Lord Jesus Christ. So you see, that's another cause and effect law. And I can tell you, I live my life based upon this cause and effect law. And it's why I don't like to hear, I'm going to try to be nice about this. I don't like to hear idiot Baptist preachers, idiot meaning they're focused only on what they think, and they think whatever they think must be true because they think it. But these idiot Baptist preachers that get up there and say, oh, well, we all just deserve hell. We just all deserve the lake of fire. And I'm saying, no, we don't all deserve the lake of fire. We did deserve the lake of fire. But then when we came to Christ and when we were reconciled to God by his Son, and now I'm a joint heir with the Son, I no longer deserve the lake of fire. I no longer deserve hell. And you see, preachers get up there and they say stupid things in front of other people, and then those people go out and they're witnessing to someone, and here's a saved man witnessing to a lost man, and the saved man thinks he's being cool. He's going to be just like his preacher, and he's going to say, well, we all just deserve hell. And the unsaved man can't even comprehend how the saved man can be that dumb to say something like that. If that saved man still deserves hell, then why in the world would you ever accept Christ and be saved? But you see, this is the dumb stuff that comes out of the mouths of men because they get up in front of a group of people and they have never meditated upon what they should actually say. They're just preaching messages. And God intended it to be much, much more accurate than just preaching some message. But the results are inescapable. They're inexorable. That is, unless some other cause and effect law is applied to influence the nature and extent of the first action. Humans then are able to predict the results of their actions and proceed in those actions or turn from them when they recognize what the ends of those actions would be. Man had been constructed to be a finite, limited being, and this system would encourage or warn him of what was in his future, at least potentially, and he could act accordingly. God built a system, and the system was perfect. Now, God's perfect cause and effect system covers the male-female relationship. Yes, it covers everything in existence, but we're looking at the relationship between a man and his woman. So, God's perfect cause and effect system covered every aspect of human existence, not the least of which is the man-woman, husband-wife relationship. In perfect love, God had established his design to warn and to deter humans from violating the only way to success and blessing. And when Adam violated, certain adverse effects became operative in both the male and female personalities. Though the whole of creation had been adversely affected by Adam's failure, the new perspectives existing between men and women would be constant reminders of the ease of violating his design and the destruction that violation brings. God designed men and women to marry and fulfill his purposes for this interpersonal relationship. He also imposed conditions that would make the relationship a curse, quote unquote, whenever one or both members sought to apply his or her own criteria, his or her own perspectives in place of God's design. The Creator did not curse the man-woman relationship. He simply designed a cause and effect system which would warn them against relating to one another naturally. That is, according to their own understanding. Their natural human concepts would bring conflict and alienation into a relationship that was supposed to be a blessing for both. And yet, even such conflict and alienation are designed to bring blessing. People say, what? No, that can't be. Oh, yes. You got to remember, these things were designed by the perfect Creator, and he didn't do anything that was second rate, period. To serve as an ever-present reminder of the destructiveness of violation, God had provided in his original design the undesirable cause and effect conditions which became active when Adam violated. He did not, however, apply these conditions in a general manner to man's environment. He specifically applied them to each of the three involved in man's violation: the serpent first, then Eve, then Adam. The man and his wife would not directly share in the curse on the serpent, but in the integral nature of all the aspects of creation, they would become subject to specific conditions that would plague their earthly existence and remind them of the necessity of knowing the criteria of the Creator's design and walking in them. No human in his or her own ability would ever be able to live the incomprehensibly blessed completeness of walking with God in a totally unalienated condition. The creation was the possession of its infinite creator, its infinite owner, and had been designed to function and interact in very specific ways that were beneficial to the whole of creation. God in love could not and would not allow any criteria of finite beings to appear better than his, because the criteria of finite beings could never actually bring about completeness of existence. His perfect system of cause and effect conditions would serve to constantly remind all humans of their need to submit themselves to the Creator's design. Neither man nor woman would have the strength resident in self to live in a manner that would make life the blessed completeness existence God intended it to be. Humans, however, have been constructed to evaluate the conditions of life and to reach conclusions that would lead them into seeing the world as it actually is. They would see that men and women were constructed differently in ways that easily arouse conflicts between them. And they would also recognize that the Creator instilled these characteristics into the genders for positive purposes that enabled them to experience blessing in their relationships to one another. This would lead them to the conclusion that in order to avoid conflict and alienation in their interpersonal and marital relationships, they must seek the Creator's perfect design criteria. Then when they would do so, God would bless and resolve the conflicts, and this successful experience would lead them into a closer walk with their Creator. Thus, the conflict and alienation manifest in every marital relationship would serve as constant reminders of how the first man and woman had both usurped authority not belonging to them and had chosen to set their own criteria for life, but with dreadful result. The experience of the first man and woman demonstrated that failure and destruction were the only results of violating the Creator's design. Never did success and blessing come from transgression, and it still doesn't. You never do good in order to do right. That doesn't work. So, Adam recorded God's statement regarding the woman's future. After stating his pre-designed result, which had come into existence upon the serpent, the Lord turned to Eve. He would yet address Adam directly, but she was the deceived helper of Adam, his subordinate who usurped the authority of her head and contributed to his failure. Though she would share in the results to be pronounced upon her husband, God imposed upon her a special individual judgment, quote unquote, a judgment, quote unquote, specific for her transgression. Eve had been deceived by Satan, but she could have resisted his influence. And yet, though her violation was similar to her husband's, it was not the same, nor was she equal in authority to him. God therefore pronounced upon Eve, the woman from whom all human life would descend, a judgment, quote unquote, a pre-existing special set of life-governing design criteria. These criteria were neither randomly selected, nor were they capricious in any way. Instead, they were corresponded exactly to the nature of her violation, to what she had done, not only in allowing herself to be deceived, but also for encouraging her husband to eat of the forbidden fruit. Think about that. She was encouraging her husband to eat of the forbidden fruit. Her will then was that her husband would eat of the forbidden fruit, just as she had done. That was her will, her desire for her husband. Adam recognized that his descendants would wonder at the goodness of the Creator when they experienced or observed the undesirable results of these new criteria in the lives of women. And how many women have questioned what they experience in conception and bringing forth children. Why would God do that? Well, it's designed. Thus, while he made clear that God himself had imposed the criteria of this judgment, quote unquote, he also described the event leading up to their imposition, including the primacy of his own culpability in the matter. Adam recorded God's pronouncement of the new criteria for the life of Eve, and indeed for the life of every woman after her. And in Genesis 3:16, we have, unto the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. And then the words, and thy desire shall be to thy husband. Notice, shall be is italicized. And he shall rule over thee. And you can see, El Haisha Amar, Harba Arbeh. It's vonek. I should say, it's vonek. The vocal schwa on the tzade. And then you go down to the latter part. And here we have El Ishek to Shukathek. Wuhu Yimshol Bach. So, literal translation. Unto the woman he said, causing to be much, I will cause to be much your pain and your conception. In pain you will bear sons. And unto your man, your design will exist, and he will rule in you. Or we might say, with respect to you. At this moment in human history, God informed his humans of two distinct new, quote unquote, new conditions they would experience in the future, new in that they had never experienced them. They were both directly addressed to the woman, but they would both necessarily involve the man. That is, just as God's judgment on the man would inexorably affect the woman, so his judgment on the woman inexorably involved and affected the man. As mankind would progress in the fulfillment of the Creator's design for humans to fill the earth, the male-female, husband-wife pairings would bring each marital partner into an involvement with the new criteria imposed upon the other. Only the Creator could change the nature and effects of these criteria, and thus they would remain inescapable reminders for all generations to come that these conditions existed because man had rejected the way of God. The first stated new criterion for woman was that her sorrows, displeasure, grief, labor in life would be greatly multiplied, especially in the experience of conception and childbirth. The Hebrew word translated multiplied, rabah, does not carry the concept found in the modern verb multiply, that something must first exist before it can be multiplied. Instead, the basic meaning of the word actually refers to being or becoming much, many, or numerous. And you got to stop and think. These things did not exist in the woman before God had said this, or before the violation. This was the same word that God used to describe one aspect of his basic design for the man and his wife. They were to multiply in the sense that they were to, quote, become many, numerous, abundant. And the woman was the primary vessel through whom the multiplication would occur. Indeed, Adam would later name her Eve, that's the word Hawa, because she was the mother of all living, quote unquote. But because of her part in the violation of God's design, she would also receive her own personal abundance, an abundance of sorrow, grief, displeasure that would accompany the fulfillment of her basic design. Thus, as the man and the woman would fulfill the basic design of their Creator, the birth of every child would be accompanied by great displeasure, experienced by the woman and witnessed by the husband, and would thus serve as a recurrent reminder of the terrible effects of violating God's design for their lives. The second stated new criterion was in relation to the fact that when Woman ate of the forbidden fruit. She had acted independently of her husband. Though Adam was present, the scripture gives no indication that his presence affected her interaction with the serpent. She acted independently, as though she were not under authority. From the nature of her judgment, God had built into Eve the ability and the authority to act independently of Adam, but she was to do this in full accord with her Creator's very good design for the roles of each gender. God had not designed woman to be totally dependent upon direction and instruction from the man, but neither was she to be independent. She was designed to be a helper, specifically corresponding to her man. She was accountable to the Creator for how she fulfilled that design. For Eve to eat of the forbidden fruit because she was deceived was one matter. But when she, quote, gave also to her husband with her, unquote, whether she voiced any words or not, she contributed to his violation of God's design as well. The active voice of the Hebrew verb translated gave, she gave also to her husband with her, indicates that Eve was the doer of the action. And whether she spoke or not, by giving to Adam, she was expressing her desire for him to eat just as she had done. Thus, Eve was accountable for how she exercised the Eve was accountable for how she exercised the independence God had built into her. And because of her part in Adam's violation, God rightly restricted the ability and authority of Eve and of all women to act independently in the future. That's a perfect design of God. It was built into the system before anything was ever created. And it came into active existence when they violated. In God's perfect design of her judgment, woman would seek to have her desire, the word is in Hebrew is teshukah. That is, usually in the lexicons, they call it a longing, a craving. It would be that idea of desire. Desire is probably a better word than the others. But in God's perfect design of her judgment, as we call it, woman would seek to have her desire, her teshukah, to be the rule in the life of her husband. Consider, when Eve gave to her husband with her, she was indicating her desire, her design to be the rule in the life of her husband, and she was indicating that her rule for his life would be for him to eat just as she had done. So that's the nature of the judgment. Woman would seek to have her desire to be the rule in the life of her husband, but her desire would not be realized. With Adam, it was realized. When Eve gave, he received it and ate. But God says, this is going to be the reminder that in the future, you're going to have this desire, you're going to have this rule, this desire for over your husband, but it's not going to be realized. Instead, notice, her husband would rule over her. Her desire to see her will ruling her husband would meet opposition from something new in his nature, a misguided sense of authority over her, a lack of willingness to submit himself to her will. Indeed, she would long to exercise her will independently, but he would rule over her longings, making her desires subject to his own will. This too would be a reminder of the terrible effects of violating the design of the Creator. Only two other passages of Scripture use wording similar to that found describing God's judgment on woman. An almost identical desire rule construction is found in Adam's account of Cain's relationship to sin. And a very similar desire statement occurs in regard to the relationship between Solomon and his beloved, both shown below. What Adam wrote of what happened between God and Cain when Cain offered an unacceptable offering. Cain thought he wanted to worship God. He wanted to worship God the way he wanted to worship God, and God should accept it. And when God did not accept his violational offering, then Cain was already in sin, so he might as well just continue there, and he did. But look at what God said to him. God offered the opportunity for him to turn from his sin and to be reconciled. But Cain would not accept. And God said, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? Implication, they knew what to do to be doing it well. They knew what the criteria well was. So he says, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. Well, what is sin lying at the door? The word for sin and the word for a sin offering, and you have the word right down here in the Hebrew, chatath. Chatath. The word for sin and for sin offering are the same word. There's an identity relationship between the sin offering and the sin for which it is being offered. And that's why that is such a close relationship. So when he said, if thou doest well, chatath, literally a sin offering, it's lying at the door. The word lieth is the Hebrew verb rovetz. It does not mean in any way that sin was crouching as if waiting to pounce. That is what has been made up. It's been concocted by English speaking preachers who never knew anything about what the Hebrew text actually said and who never would study it to see what the word actually was. They just heard somebody else preach and they thought, oh, this is good preaching, man. Yeah, sin's lying there at the door and it's just waiting to pounce on you. No, it was not. Sin was already in control of the life of Cain. He was already in violation, having offered that which was not the design of God for the offering. Sin wasn't waiting to get him. It already had him. He'd been in it for some time already. He didn't choose the wrong offering just because, well, God, I'm going to offer the best I have. That's not what he did. He knew what was good. And that's what the Hebrew text actually says. It says, here's the descriptive literal translation. And this question, exist not, if you will be good, the lifting of it? Oh, that sounds crazy. It will exist. So would not your offering be lifted up and accepted in that sense? If you will do it, good. But see, there's a criterion for good. And here's that word good, tetiv. And here's tetiv again in the second line. And God said, and if you will not be good to the opening or at the opening, that is the door, a sin offering exists lying in repose, just laying there, laid back. There was no sin waiting to pounce upon Cain. He was already in violation. That's why God did not accept his offering, because the offering was in violation of what God had already determined to be good. But you notice, up above we had, for the woman, and unto thee shall be his desire, unto you, woman, will be his desire, that's your husband's desire. And, I'm sorry, this is, I'm looking, I need to go back up here because I want to show you this difference. But here it was, and your desire is going to be to your husband. So it's going to be, and this shall be is a valid insertion there for the verb. And so you're going to have this desire toward your husband, and God says, and he's going to rule over you. Now, but see, what should Adam have done? Should Eve have expressed her desire for her husband to violate? Having been deceived, she then offers to her husband to have him violate with her in deception. And by the way, women are far more easily led astray in their desires than are men in the present day. And you say, oh, that's chauvinistic. No, that's God's design. It's the way humans are designed. The man was designed to be the head over the creation, and the woman was designed to be his perfect helper in fulfilling all that God had for him to do. But that would also say he is designed to help her to fulfill everything that God had for her to do. What's so silly about that? The silliness is that in this day and age, people hate God so much, even in our churches, that they say, no, I'm not doing that. And if you want to find out what women think about things and who women think the authority is, just start teaching about proper authority in the relationship between men and women in a church. And you might not make it out alive. And when he said it to Cain, here was this sin, this thing that had a desire. This was an animal lying at the door, which was apparently a pet of Cain or his family. Here was the perfect offering lying at the door of his dwelling, and that pet had a desire for Cain. But what Cain was supposed to do, Cain was supposed to rule over him. He was supposed to overrule the desire of that animal for him. Now, these things are so clearly related to one another, each one designed to help us to understand the other. So let's go down here a little bit more. In Song of Solomon, we saw this, where the Shulamite says, I exist to my beloved. That means I belong to my beloved. And then she says, and his desire is not, it's not just toward me, it's upon me. That's the actual word she used. In both Genesis accounts, God used the Hebrew preposition el, not el. El is a preposition. El is the word God, to describe the relationship of go back. God used the Hebrew preposition el, that is to, unto, towards. That's a directional thing, to describe the relationship of the desire to its object. But in Song of Solomon, he used the preposition al, a different preposition, on or upon, to do the same thing. The Genesis preposition el denotes motion to or direction towards, whether physical or mental, some condition or location that is not yet attained. So when woman has her desire toward her husband, that desire can be expressed toward the husband, but it has not yet attained. It is directional to him. The Song of Solomon preposition denotes that the desire of the beloved as that which is upon the girl who speaks. That is, the condition exists. So his desire is upon her. The condition exists upon her. It doesn't have to be expressed directionally. That's already passed. This difference in prepositions then signifies that in the Genesis accounts, The desire was regarded as potentially occurring, but was unrealized. While in Song of Solomon, the desire was already realized. Just as woman would have a desire toward her husband, in the same manner, the sin offering which lay at Cain's door had a desire toward Cain. The husband would overrule his wife, and in God's design, Cain was to overrule sin or overrule that sin offering. The Shulamite girl of Song of Solomon was exactly where God designed her to be. She was subject to the desire of her husband. History has borne out the fact of this judgment. Generally speaking, man has subjugated woman with little regard for her own personal feelings and needs. In non-Christian cultures and religions, such subjugation and humiliation has been almost universal until very recent times, her husband often having even the power of life and death over her. And that's from Henry Morris's Genesis record, page 123. And this still happens. This is still happening. Such harsh rule is far beyond the intent of God's judgment. And yet this is consistent with man's practice of misusing everything God has provided. In nominally Christian countries, and even in many Christian homes and churches, the proper roles of husband and wife have often been distorted in one direction or another. And there's more that's going to be added. God's design, they were to be one flesh. Levasar echad. He was to cling to her. He was to cherish her. Now, you can see down here, as we mentioned it the other day, but we'll just touch on this here. Notice the green relates to the desire. And you can see in this, here's the desire, and then the direction, to thy husband. And he shall rule over thee. So she has a desire, but she's going to be overruled. The husband, he is the one that's going to rule. In Genesis 4:7, unto thee, that's toward Cain, the man, would be the desire of the animal at the door, the sin offering. And in God's design, thou, that was Cain, is supposed to rule over him. He's supposed to overrule, and he should have offered it, but he would not do it. And then in the last one, when the Song of Solomon, the Shulamite said of her husband, said his desire is, and King James says, toward me. That is not a good translation of that preposition. The preposition, you say, are you judging the King James? Yes, I am. You better believe it, because I read the Hebrew text as God wrote it. And so when I look at this, and we have here, I don't know how that Z got there, but you can see it when you rearrangement to show similar structure, and look at the structure of these. 3:16, your desire will exist toward your man, and he will rule over you. With respect to Cain, its desire, that's the desire of the sin offering, exists toward you. Even the same understood verb in the same relationship. You know, how can we miss this? How's this been missed for all this time? It's been missed because people wouldn't study what God wrote. But let's look at this. So its desire exists toward you, just like toward your man. And you will rule over him, over that thing that has this desire. When you come to the Shulamite, she says, his desire, now it exists, but she doesn't say toward me. It's not something that's unrealized. It's something that is actually in effect upon her right now. His desire exists upon me. And thus, the understood balance of the statement would be, because his desire exists upon me, then it would be, and he rules over me. It's not that she's going to overrule him, but he rules over me because his desire is upon me. It is laying upon her. And so, you look at these things, and here's just a different layout of the same thing. But look at this last little table here. Relationship between what happened to the woman, or what the woman did, what Cain did. The woman usurped authority to act contrary to her man's teaching of God's design for subordination. Cain usurped authority to act contrary to his father's teaching of God's design for sacrifices. Are you telling me that Adam did not properly instruct his children after him regarding the nature of a proper sacrifice? I used to be that dumb, but I'm not that dumb anymore. Now, the woman, she rejected God's authorities to subordinate her to her man. What did Cain do? Cain rejected God's authority to determine the nature of an acceptable offering. The woman, she chose to act independently of the design of God, as though she possessed the authority and ability to determine that eating the fruit was better for her than not eating, as God had instructed. Cain, he chose to act independently of the design of God, as though he possessed the authority and ability to determine that a vegetable offering was better for him than an animal offering, as God had instructed. The woman, as soon as she determined in her mind to act independently, she had come into existence, into a state of having experientially violated the Creator's design. As soon as she determined this in her mind, and thus further violation became a greater propensity. What about Cain? As soon as he determined in his mind to act independently, he had come into existence, into a state of having experientially violated the Creator's design, and thus further violation became a greater propensity. The woman demonstrated her continuing state of experiential violation by encouraging her man to violate as well. Cain demonstrated his continuing state of experiential violation by murdering his brother and disputing with God. So, similarities, I'm persuaded God put those there very specifically designed. No, I'm not going to say I'm persuaded. It is an absolute simple fact that anybody who reads the scriptures can perceive that God put those texts in the way he did so that we would be able to understand perfectly what his design was in the matter, so that we would perfectly understand that what's going to happen, not because God said, all right, now that you're all messed up, I'm going to put this judgment on you. And now you're the woman, you're going to have a desire for your husband, but he's going to rule over you. And that's going to cause conflict. It's going to cause differences and alienation between them. No, that's what they brought into existence when they violated. He didn't have to pronounce the judgment for it to have occurred. But when he pronounced it, he gave greater clarity to what was going to happen as it had already come into existence in them. And now this is going to be greater clarity for them so that they would not mistake where their conflicts and their alienation arose. They didn't arise from the Creator's design. They arose from their violation of the Creator's design. And that's why God expresses this to us, so that we would know. And then the woman would say, yes, I have a design for my husband. I need to be careful how I express my design for my husband so that it does not arouse in him that overruling mentality, so that when there is something that I have a desire for my husband and it is not going to be well received by him, he will be able to respond in a manner that helps us both to avoid conflict and alienation in our relationship. You see, that's the design of God, to seek his way and to not go into conflict and alienation in our relationships. Women must think before speaking, and men must think before speaking in response. And then you say, well, what if the man comes up with the idea and it's not a good idea? Then the man must realize that he is married to a female human being who is designed to be his helper. And when he comes up with an idea that is not necessarily best, or that it's even different from what he thought might be a good thing to do, but it's going to be different in when it's weighed in the mind of his helper, then he brings these things out in such a way that it makes it easy for his helper to be a helper and to help him evaluate things without conflict and alienation being aroused. But you see, that's the way God designed it to be. Each one loving the other, that is, helping the other one to fulfill the design of God perfectly in his or her life. But we don't need to do that. We're Christians. We're believers. We don't need that stuff. And it's the same kind of stuff that caused my dad to take his own life, to shoot himself that night in January of 1954. It's the same kind of stuff that caused my brother-in-law to shoot himself. It's the same garbage that is destroying lives of people in our churches. It's the same kind of stuff that has led people, especially men, but women do it as well, to call somebody and say, you know what, I think I've been thinking about just taking my own life. Because there's conflict and alienation in the closest of all relationships that exist in human existence. You say, well, the closest is that of God. Oh, don't give me your stupidity. The closest human relationship is that between a man and his woman, a woman and her man. And both are to be one in their relationship to their God, the God who exists. Any thoughts before we go today? Any questions, remarks, whatever?
Brother Phillips has a hand raised.
Yes.
Hi, Brother Sheets. Would it be possible to get a copy of these notes from the last couple of weeks?
Yes. Actually, I was going to send these out last week, but I needed to scan through them and make a few minor adjustments, and I did some of that. And so I think now they can be sent out. And but I can do that. I'll send
Thank
it to you. Anyone else? All right, very good. If no other comments at the present, then we'll go to, need to get over here. We'll stop our recording. Let's
Another one
see.
for you to do, Brother Sheets, that would be a good topic is the quote unquote will of God that's as the way it's taught.
I do have some of that in the paper on the will of God. But yes, that is a major, I don't know. You know what, Stephen, it's like no matter what God has done that was good, we have managed to turn it into something that's not good.
Agreed.
It's incredible. And I don't say y'all have done it. I say weans. That includes me just as well as anyone else. And it's so sad to think about the results. But okay.